Hello and welcome to this BioProcess International Ask the Expert webcast. I'm your host, Leah Razan, the online editor for BioProcess International. Before we get started, just a couple of notes. This webcast is being recorded and will be made available for replay in the multimedia section of our website. We've muted the audio lines, but we welcome you to type in your questions for our speaker in the chat window on your screen. After the presentation, we will begin the question and answer portion, and I will ask our speaker your questions from the chat window. Your questions in the chat window will only be visible to myself and our speaker. So thank you for joining us today. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Kristen DeVito from Catalent Pharma Solutions.
Thank you, Leah, for the introduction, and thank you to our attendees for taking time from your day to join us for this webinar. In today's discussion, I'll be speaking to some of the challenges surrounding the planning and execution of supply strategies for clinical trials with an emphasis on biologics. First, a bit about Catalent. Catalent is the leading provider of global clinical supply solutions experienced in working with companies and clinical trials of all sizes. We have full service capabilities to be an end-to-end clinical supplies partner, and our services include clinical supply management, comparator and reference product sourcing, packaging and labeling, specialty handling and cold chain, clinical storage and distribution, and returns and destruction. We have the practical experience to understand and anticipate potential clinical supply challenges on a local, regional, and global level, ensuring all variables can be considered as we develop clinical supply strategies. With an extensive network of GMP packaging facilities in the U.S., Europe, and Asia Pacific, plus a network of over 50 audited and managed third-party depots, all with cold chain capabilities and a 99% on-time delivery track record, you can depend on Catalent to reliably supply your clinical sites around the globe. Today we will be briefly touching upon the advantages of an integrated supply chain, explore various factors of the clinical plan and supply attributes that can add complexity to the supply chain, and also discuss forecasting as part of successful planning. For more than 25 years, Catalent has been managing complex clinical trials on a global basis. With a range of integrated services, Catalent has the necessary expertise and commitment to quality to successfully handle the challenges associated with biologics development. By using Catalent's integrated service capabilities, you benefit from overall shortened timelines and cost savings by employing parallel planning and processing between finished drug product and clinical supply deliverables, powered by collaboration and integrated project management. The number of factors which impact the complexity of planning and management of your clinical supplies are exponential. Some of the top contributing factors and their impact on clinical supply will be discussed next. The requirement for an expiry or retest date on clinical labels outside of the United States presents challenges if the clinical supply shelf life does not exceed the duration of the trial. Blinding the supplies requires the labeled retest date to be the shortest expiry of all matching products in the campaign, with the blinded package lot number printed on the clinical label. The potential for retest date relabeling should be considered when designing clinical labels and the kitting strategies for the trials to ensure the product can accommodate an additional retest date label as per regulatory requirements. In the EU, not following regulation could result in delays and rework in order to meet those requirements. Also consider the ease of any retest date update operation should it be required. A single layer dispensing unit is easier to update and may be able to be updated at time of distribution using just-in-time labeling strategies as opposed to a complicated kit structure of many layers requiring the need to recollate different cartons and kits. Also, make sure to investigate country-specific requirements regarding stability data necessary to support retest dating. Accelerated stability studies may be accepted for some investigational products in some countries, but not in others. So, effective sourcing of comparator and commercial products can be one of the most challenging, stressful, and expensive aspects of supply chain planning and execution. One should research well in advance the markets where you are conducting your trials and thoroughly understand regulatory requirements and constraints so as to identify the best sourcing strategy for your trial. whether it be a central, regional, local, or combination of each as a source, or a strategy of purchasing direct from the manufacturer or through an intermediary, each solution presents its own advantages and disadvantages. Some innovators may restrict exportation, and many will request upfront information about the study and the intended use before considering a sale. This is to assure the product will be used for clinical research and not resold on the open market. Also consider what happens when many companies are looking for the same products at the same time in the same market. Will there be a potential for supply shortages, and do you have mitigation strategies? Sourcing of biologics, especially products used in biosimilar trials, can be highly competitive with a limited number of lots available for any given time, which can sell out in a matter of days once available. Blinding of comparators can be extremely challenging, and one needs to consider the possibility that the innovator may change components or other presentation of the product mid-trial. Lack of stability data on commercial products requires strict management of temperature exposure during the supply chain. If working with a cold chain product, it is also important to consider kit size and the suitability of kits to fit into qualified shipping containers to maintain temperature during transit, and also storage capacity for those kits at the clinical site. If your clinical supply is considered as hazardous by IATA requirements, for instance, if products contain alcohol or are pressurized, there may be restrictions on the quantity which can be shipped at any one time, and shipments are required to be packed out by persons who are trained and certified in IATA requirements. This could reduce some flexibility in your distribution plan. If you are working with controlled drug substances, each country will have its own strict, unique regulatory requirements on import and export, and you will most likely need a local depot in every single country you're recruiting patients. There are global challenges with varied regulations and import-export complexities, and the European Union has some particular challenges, including the additional requirements for qualified persons, or QPs, declarations and certifications of the supply chain, and also to impending legal and regulatory changes. Brexit, or the exit of the UK from the EU, is looming, with an exit date of March 29th of this year if no exit deal is agreed between the UK and EU with other provisions, and will have an impact to regulatory and commercial aspects of clinical trials between the UK and the EU. Another challenge which is coming upon us is the new EU clinical trial regulation, which replaces the current EU clinical trial directive. Elements of the new regulation that have impact on clinical supply are that it will now be a regulation which all member countries must follow, so there is no longer to be a patchwork of individual country regulations. It provides for a streamlined authorization process, and it increases restrictions on labeling requirements, detailed now in Annex 6, requiring retest or expiry dates to be present on all labels, including immediate containers. The regulation is expected to become effective in 2020. The implications of this new regulation could be significant and require additional consideration for planning. The single application and approval process could result in a large number of countries to have regulatory approval at the same time. The supply chain must be ready for this. Planning and forecasting to limit the amount of relabeling of expiration dates is essential, and if expiration dating is required, it's critical to plan for this in advance, limiting kit complexity and providing adequate space on components for additional labels, plus robust procedures for the management of expiry updating at clinical sites and depots. There are volumes of uncertainties faced during the planning and execution of the clinical trial. How should you plan if recruitment is slower or faster than anticipated? When will you need to manufacture additional campaigns, resupply depots and sites? And how much overage is required? Every decision is a balancing act of timeline, cost, and insurance of supply considerations. How much do I send to each site and distribution depot to make sure that drug is available for every patient when it is needed, but also reduce unnecessary waste? Can I also optimize my distribution costs? The complexity of the clinical trial and the supply chain will influence the required sophistication of forecasting and modeling tools that would be best suited for planning. When consulting with our customers to determine quantities required for a study, we were often asked, what percentage of overage is typical for a study? A generically applied or random overage calculation may result in high levels of waste or critical shortage of supplies depending on the study characteristics. In determining appropriate overage, there are considerations for necessary overage or potential waste required to accommodate the unpredictable enrollment phase of the trial. Factors include the number of treatment groups and kit types in the study, along with enrollment rate and clinical site-to-patient ratios. Feeding of kits to sites to provide a buffer for unknown future enrollment is required in addition to the more predictable kit requirements of future patient visits for already enrolled patients. Titration and dosing variability require kits for all potential dispensing schemes to be available for each patient visit and often include investigator choice of dose at the time of patient visit, adding to uncertainty. Employing simulation tools can be extremely useful by providing data on which to base optimized decisions for the uniqueness of each trial. Overages can be kept to a minimum by utilizing simulation to anticipate drug demand over time. Purchase quantities and packaging campaigns can be optimized based upon projected enrollment rates, country start dates, site initiation dates, and expiry of product to minimize any drug expiring before use or left over at the end of the trial. Simulation also aids the development of alternate plans for scenarios such as slower enrollment or faster enrollment, changes to countries and to site start dates, variances to anticipated treatment durations, drop rates, and the list goes on. Illustrated here is an example of how simulation can be used to help plan for investigational products with short expiry dates. The goal is to use up as much of the supply as possible before expiration. The example uses the consumption rate of the slower randomization scenario to plan for the quantity to package for the campaign, but uses the fastest randomization scenario to plan for the release of the next campaign. This mitigates risk of supply shortages while minimizing waste. Completely de-risking the supply chain can have significant budgetary impact. One needs to carefully identify and consider all factors and balance moving parts of your clinical supply strategy and supply chain as early as possible. Complexity will often increase significantly as you progress through clinical trial phases, and one needs to understand all current and future regulatory and quality requirements to ensure adherence and reduce risk of future issues due to noncompliance. Having worked in clinical supply for 25 years, I've had the opportunity to interact with a great variety of trials and sponsors with different levels of experience in clinical supply management. I thought it would be useful to close today's discussion with a number of questions to ask internally and with your clinical partners. When understood, having answers and roles and responsibilities understood may avoid gaps or issues in the planning and execution of the supply chain for your clinical trials. Some of these would include making sure that you have unblinded supply management if your study is blinded. Many companies that we work with, not until maybe after setup and asking about the roles and responsibilities to interact and be a blinded supply manager in the interactive response technologies system that might be employed, do they really realize that they need to identify that resource because everybody within the company is blinded? I would say that's one of the most common ones. There's additional questions about, the overage, which we've already discussed, monitoring levels, identifying who would be providing QP declarations for CTA submissions, et cetera. So I would like to thank you very much for your time today, and Lee, turn it back over to you for any questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kristen. So the first question is, what are the most common issues that people run into if they start planning late in the process?
So I would say some of the most common and significant challenges that may be encountered would be difficulty in finding a suitable blinding strategy, especially with biologics and the presentations of those. You might have to be very creative to achieve a blind to a comparator that's used in the trial. And it may have manufacturing considerations during your development process, as well as finding, which presentation within which market that you might purchase a comparator. Also, timelines for translations and booklet label production for global trials, being ready for each country start date, and for the first patient in can be a challenge. And then additionally, once again, within a global trial, making sure that you understand the timelines required for import and other regulatory requirements to make sure that you have the product there when the first patient is scheduled to start.
Okay. And what time during the process should you start thinking about clinical trial supply?
The planning timeline will be very dependent on the size of your trial and also the global reach of the trial, as well as other trial complexities. But especially if you're planning on a global trial, you really need to be planning for your supply chain strategy a good 18 months before your first patient visit. And once again, if there are significant blinding considerations and you know that you're going into, for instance, a phase 3 trial and you have an idea of the comparator that you'll be using, you may even need to be thinking before that with manufacturing considerations or being able to employ customized blinding strategies to be successful for the trial.
Okay, and what makes a biologic clinical trial plan more complex than a small molecule clinical trial plan?
Well, part of it is the cold chain aspect of it. You have to maintain the integrity of the product through the entire supply chain. That can add cost and complexity. It does mean that you need to have speed and delivery and reliability, so that you don't have product wastage or delays because you have excursions that need to be adjudicated during the clinical trial. Also, many of the more complex trials, just from the clinical design, tend to be supported and investigating biologics. And so just understanding the setup of the planning of the packaging to match the dispensing with the patient can also be challenging, along with short expiry dates, which we've already discussed earlier during the presentation.
Okay, great. Thanks. And thanks to our audience for joining us. The recorded version of this webcast will be available for on-demand viewing on our website. And as a registered attendee, you'll receive a follow-up email providing you with a direct link. We look forward to having you join us at future BioProcess International Ask the Expert webcasts. Look for those announcements in your inbox. Have a nice day. Bye.